Detroit, Michigan, March 15, 1945. In the windowless darkroom of the Detroit Police Department's Bureau of Criminal Identification, where the only light came from a dim red bulb overhead, police photographer Elwood Brennan hunched over a developing tray. His fingers, reeking of fixative and hypo, gently rocked the shallow pan, and on the photographic paper an image slowly materialized from the chemical fog. First, the blurred outlines, then sharper definition. A crime scene. The industrial district near the old warehouses by the river. A body. Elwood had photographed hundreds of them over 17 years on the job, and he'd learned long ago to see them as subjects, not as people. But when the image fully resolved, his hand froze. On the collar of the victim's jacket, he saw a button. Small, carved from bone, with a distinctive crack down the center and an unusual pattern. 4 petals resembling a clover. Elwood straightened slowly. His heart hammered so loudly it seemed to drown out the running water in the sink. He'd seen this button before. Most recently 4 years ago. On another body. In a different part of the city. But not just 4 years ago. He'd seen it 15 years back. And 10. And 7. Always the same. Always on bodies whose deaths were ruled accidental. And this was only the beginning. Because once he started digging, he'd understand that all these years he hadn't just been documenting crimes. He'd been documenting a hunt. A methodical hunt stretched across a decade and a half, where victims were chosen by some inscrutable principle, and the killer left his signature knowing the system would shield him. To understand how Elwood found himself in that dark room with a photograph that would overturn his entire life, you have to go back 17 years. To the day he first walked through the doors of the Bureau and didn't yet know his profession would become not just a job, but a curse. Summer 1928. Elwood had just finished his discharge from the Army after 3 years stationed at Fort Lewis in Washington State. He was 25, born in 1903, with a technical school diploma in telegraphy behind him and a vague dream of becoming a photojournalist, capturing life instead of death. But the Detroit Free Press politely explained they had no openings and he lacked experience. However, the Wayne County Sheriff's Department needed a photographer for their new crime laboratory. Government work, steady salary, prospects for advancement. They promised housing assistance within a year or 2. Elwood came to the interview at the old precinct building on Beaubien Street. 3 stories of yellow brick with peeling paint and bars on the first-floor windows. Inside, it smelled of carbolic soap, tobacco, and something else, musty and stale, which Elwood would later learn to recognize as the smell of archives where files about human tragedies were stored. He was interviewed by the bureau chief, Mortimer J. Aldrich, a lean man of about 60 with penetrating eyes behind thick spectacles. On the desk before him lay Elwood's service record, a thin folder with character references from the Army and technical school. Aldrich asked without looking up from the papers. Elwood nodded. He thought he was ready. He'd served at Fort Lewis, seen soldiers die in training accidents, witnessed the aftermath of brawls in town during weekend liberty. He thought nothing could shock him. He was wrong. He saw his first body a week after starting work. Aldrich sent him out with an experienced detective named Hargrove on a routine call. A domestic homicide in a rooming house on the east side. It was a middle-aged woman found in her own room. Elwood followed the detective inside, carrying his heavy Graflex camera, and stopped in the doorway. He'd seen death in the service. But this was different. This was in a home where a kettle had boiled just yesterday, where mason jars of preserves sat on the windowsill, where photographs of children hung on the wall. Death had come here, into ordinary life, and shattered it. Detective Hargrove, a heavy-set man of about 50 whose face had long ceased to register anything, turned to Elwood. __quote _3 __. Elwood set up his tripod. His hands trembled, but he managed. He focused, pressed the shutter release. The flash powder flared with harsh white light, transforming the room for an instant into a theatrical set. The click of the shutter. Advancing the film. Another shot. The mechanical actions helped him avoid thinking about how this wasn't just a subject, but someone's mother, wife, daughter. He made all the necessary exposures, stepped out onto the landing, leaned against the wall, breathed deeply, fighting nausea. Hargrove came out after him, lit a cigarette. __quote, _4, __. But that evening, back in his room at the YMCA, Elwood couldn't eat. He vomited in the communal bathroom down the hall. He sat on the cold tile, head in hands, thinking he couldn't go back tomorrow. The next day, he came to the bureau. Aldrich was in his office sorting through paperwork. He saw Elwood, nodded for him to sit. Elwood said nothing for a moment, then asked. Aldrich removed his spectacles, cleaned the lenses with a handkerchief. Elwood nodded. He understood. This wasn't about emotions. It was about duty, about someone having to do it. And if not him, then who? "I'll stay," he said. Aldrich set a glass of water and a pack of Lucky Strikes on the desk in front of him. "You'll adjust," he said quietly. "Or you'll quit. There's no third option." Elwood didn't quit. He adjusted. Within a month, he could calmly photograph, analyze lighting angles, select optimal exposure times. Within 6 months, he was the best photographer in the bureau. His images were sharp, informative, professional. Exactly what crime scene photographs should be. Cold documents devoid of emotion. Aldrich occasionally praised him, sparingly in his reserved manner. __quote _13 ___. And it was true. Elwood truly did see details. He noticed things detectives considered insignificant. A strangely positioned object, an unusual mark, a detail of clothing that didn't fit the overall picture. Years passed. Elwood married Constance, a secretary from the county courthouse. They met at a municipal dance in Grand Circus Park in the summer of 1929. She was quiet, intelligent, with kind eyes. They married 6 months after meeting. In 1930, their daughter Helen was born. They got a small apartment in a walk-up. Then, in 1935, a 2-bedroom flat in a newer building near Highland Park. Life settled into a steady, predictable rhythm. Work became routine. Mornings, he'd arrive at the bureau, receive assignments, respond to scenes, return, develop film, print photographs, file them in case folders. Day after day, year after year. Murders, suicides, accidents, fires, automobile crashes. He photographed all of it with professional detachment. As Aldrich had advised, he didn't think of victims as people. But there was one thing Elwood did on his own initiative that nobody knew about. He kept his own personal archive. Duplicates of every photograph he made for the department, stored at home in an old metal footlocker in the closet. Why? He couldn't fully explain it himself. Maybe it was professional instinct. Maybe distrust of a system where cases were often closed for political reasons and evidence disappeared. Or maybe just the habit of someone who'd spent his life documenting reality and feared it might evaporate. Every evening after finishing the department prints, he'd make one more set. For himself. Dry them separately, label them, slip them into envelopes, take them home, hide them in the footlocker. Constance knew about it but didn't ask why. She'd long understood her husband's work had a dark side she was better off not examining. He first saw the button in February 1931. Elwood was 28 then, Helen barely a year old. The case seemed routine at first glance. The body of a young woman found in a basement storeroom of an abandoned building on the edge of the Corktown district. Official version: accidental death while intoxicated. Woman walking home late at night. Decided to cut through a vacant lot. Slipped on icy steps. Fell. Struck her head. Her name was Margaret Oleander. Elwood learned this from the preliminary report. 32 years old, unmarried, worked occasional shifts at a laundry on Michigan Avenue when they'd have her. Known to police for vagrancy and public intoxication. No known relatives. No one had reported her missing. Her body had been discovered by two boys looking for salvage metal, 3 days after death, according to the medical examiner's estimate. Elwood arrived at the scene with Detective Hargrove on a Tuesday morning. February snow crusted the streets, turned gray and filthy by automobile traffic. The abandoned building was a former boarding house, condemned 2 years earlier, windows boarded up, but the boards pried loose by transients seeking shelter. The basement was damp, dark, low-ceilinged. Water stained the walls. It smelled of mildew and urine and something else. Decay, both human and structural. Broken bottles, cigarette butts, rags littered the floor. A makeshift camp in one corner, newspapers for bedding, a rusted coffee can for a chamber pot. Typical bum's den, as Hargrove said dismissively. Elwood made the required photographs. Wide shot of the space, the body, clothing details, position of the hands. When shooting a close-up of the face and upper torso, he noticed a detail. On the collar of the victim's old coat was a button clearly not from that garment. All the other buttons were plastic, gray, standard issue. But this one stood out. Bone, yellowed with age, with a crack down the middle and an unusual design. 4 petals resembling a clover or 4-leaf pattern. Elwood photographed it separately, in close-up. Professional habit. Document the details. "What's this?" he asked Hargrove, pointing to the button. The detective glanced indifferently. "Hell if I know. Probably picked it up somewhere. These types rummage through trash, sew on whatever they find. Not relevant. Accidental death, alcohol in her system. Case closed." Elwood said nothing more. But when he developed the negatives and made prints, he gave that button shot extra attention. Something about it bothered him. Not the button itself, but the way it was sewn on. Carefully, with strong thread. Not like someone casually attaching a found object, like someone who wanted it to stay. He filed the photographs in the case folder, made his duplicate set for the home archive. That evening, he studied the button photograph under a magnifying glass. The 4-petal design was hand-carved, precise despite the crack. Old craftsmanship. He dated it mentally to the 1890s, maybe earlier. Strange thing to find on a down-and-out woman's coat in 1931. He shrugged it off. One odd detail among thousands. Nothing more. But in November 1934, he saw the button again. Another body. Another woman. This time in Hamtramck, the Polish neighborhood north of downtown. Found in an alley behind St. Florian's Church on Holbrook Avenue. The victim was identified as Dorothea Kaminski, age 41, seamstress, widow. She'd lived alone in a rented room above a bakery 3 blocks from where she was found. The landlady reported she'd gone out Saturday evening to deliver some mending to a customer and never returned. Her body was discovered Sunday morning by parishioners arriving for early mass. Official ruling? Heart attack while walking home. She'd collapsed, struck her head on the pavement as she fell. No witnesses. The medical examiner noted she'd had a history of heart palpitations. The landlady confirmed she'd complained of chest pains the previous week. Natural causes, tragic but not suspicious. Death certificate signed, case closed within 48 hours. Body released to the church for burial in a paupers section of the Catholic cemetery. Elwood photographed the scene on that cold November morning. The alley was narrow, brick walls on both sides, the kind of shortcut locals used. Dorothea Kaminski lay near the back entrance to the church, her body positioned as if she'd been walking toward the street and simply fallen. Her worn coat was buttoned to the neck against the autumn chill. Her handbag lay beside her, contents undisturbed, a few coins, a rosary, needles and thread. Elwood made his exposures methodically. The alley approach. The body's position, close-ups of the head wound where she'd struck the brick pavement. Standard crime scene documentation, even for an apparent natural death. Elwood photographed the scene, and when he developed the prints, there it was. On the deceased's dress, pinned near the collar, the same button. Bone. Crack down the center, 4-petal clover design. Identical. He sat in the darkroom staring at the wet print hanging on the drawing line. His pulse quickened. 2 bodies, 3 years apart, different parts of the city. Both women from the margins of society, one a vagrant, one a seamstress who lived alone. Both deaths ruled accidental or natural, both wearing the same distinctive button. Coincidence? He wanted to believe it was coincidence. Maybe there'd been a batch of these buttons. Maybe a dozen women bought them at the same shop decades ago. Maybe. But professional instinct, honed over 6 years of crime scene work, whispered otherwise. This wasn't coincidence. This was a signature. He made his duplicate, filed the official prints. That night, he went home, retrieved the 1931 set from his footlocker, compared them under a lamp while Constance slept. The buttons were identical. Not similar, identical. Same crack, same wear pattern, same carving style. Even the way they were sewn on, careful stitches, strong thread, positioned prominently on the collar or shoulder. Elwood sat there in the yellow lamplight, feeling cold despite the steam radiator clanking in the corner. The apartment was quiet except for that metallic knocking and the occasional creak of settling floorboards. Through the thin walls, he could hear the Goldsteins' radio playing dance music, muffled and distant. He laid the 2 photographs side by side. Margaret Oleander, 1931. Dorothea Kaminsky, 1934. Different women, different circumstances, different neighborhoods, but connected by that button. That damned button. If this was a signature, if someone was deliberately placing these buttons on victims, then certain things followed logically. First, these weren't accidents. They were murders. Carefully planned murders staged to look like accidents or natural deaths. Second, the killer had access to multiple identical buttons, suggesting he'd purchased or collected them at some point. Third, the killer was patient, methodical. 3 years between the first 2 victims. That argued against someone acting from uncontrolled impulse. This was controlled, calculated. Fourth, the killer was confident these deaths wouldn't be properly investigated, which meant either he was very lucky or he had some way of ensuring investigations stayed superficial. That last point troubled Elwood most. Lucky twice, you could believe. But if there were more victims, if this pattern continued, luck stopped being an explanation, which left influence, power, connection to the system that investigated deaths and determined how much scrutiny they received. Elwood stared at the photographs until his eyes burned. Then he carefully returned the 1931 set to the footlocker, filed the 1934 set separately in a new envelope marked Pattern, Button. He locked the footlocker, climbed into bed beside Constance. She stirred slightly, settled back into sleep. He lay awake until dawn, thinking. If this was a signature, if someone was deliberately placing these buttons on victims, then these weren't accidents. They were murders. Murders staged to look like accidents. Murders the system had ruled as closed cases. He should report this. Tell Aldrich. Tell the detectives. Open an investigation. But an investigation into what? 2 deaths 3 years apart? Deaths already closed and filed? Without bodies, both had been buried long since, without witnesses, without any evidence beyond a button that could be explained a dozen innocent ways. Who would listen? Who would care? Elwood put the photographs back in the footlocker, locked it, tried to forget about it. This wasn't his job. He was a photographer, not a detective. He documented evidence. Others interpreted it, but he couldn't forget. Every case he worked from then on, he looked for that button. Examined every collar, every garment, every detail. For 3 years, he found nothing. And he began to think maybe it had been coincidence after all. Then came January 1938. A woman found dead in the boiler room of a tenement building on the Lower East Side. Ruled carbon monoxide poisoning. She'd fallen asleep near a faulty furnace. Tragic accident. Elwood photographed the scene. And there, on her worn housecoat, pinned just below the shoulder. The button. Same bone, same crack, same four-petal clover. 3 bodies, 7 years spanning 1931 to 1938. 3 women, 3 accidents, 3 buttons. This time, Elwood didn't hesitate. He went straight to Aldrich's office the next morning, brought the photographs, all 3 sets, meticulously organized in chronological order, each button shot in large to show the identical pattern. Aldrich listened in silence as Elwood laid out the prints on his desk. The morning light from the window fell across the photographs, illuminating the faces of 3 dead women and 3 identical buttons. Elwood explained the pattern. The identical buttons, the suspiciously convenient accidents, the span of years suggesting a careful, methodical killer, the way each case had been closed within 48 hours with minimal investigation, the fact that all 3 victims were marginalized women, no families to ask questions, no influential connections to demand justice. When Elwood finished, Aldrich sat back in his chair, removed his spectacles, cleaned them slowly with a white handkerchief he pulled from his breast pocket. The silence stretched. Outside in the hallway, typewriters clattered. A telephone rang. Someone laughed. Normal office sounds that seemed obscene in the face of what lay on the desk between them. Finally, Aldrich spoke. "Brennan, you're a good photographer, one of the best I've seen. But you're not a detective." "Sir, with respect, this isn't detective work. This is pattern recognition. 3 identical objects on 3 bodies over 7 years. That's not coincidence." "Maybe not, but it's also not evidence of murder. Show me cause of death inconsistencies. Show me witnesses. Show me anything beyond a button that could have been attached by anyone at any time." "The button was deliberately placed. You don't know that. You're inferring that. And inference isn't evidence." Aldrich leaned forward, his voice lower, almost gentle. "Look, son, I understand. You see patterns in photographs. That's your gift. But sometimes a pattern is just coincidence. Life is messy. Strange things happen. Yes, it's odd. But odd isn't criminal. What if there's a 4th body? A 5th? If there is, and if there's actual evidence of foul play, then we investigate. Until then, these cases are closed. I can't reopen 3 separate investigations spanning 7 years based on a button. The chief would laugh me out of his office." Aldrich paused, then lowered his voice further, glancing toward the closed door. "And between you and me, even if you're right, even if someone is killing these women, they're picking victims nobody cares about. Vagrants, loners, women without families or connections. The department doesn't have resources to chase ghosts. We barely have resources to handle current cases. You know how many murders we had last month? 17. 17 cases demanding detectives, lab work, court time. And you want me to divert resources to 3 closed cases from years ago?" Elwood gathered up his photographs slowly, carefully, as if they were fragile things that might crumble in his hands. His hands shook slightly. "So we do nothing. We do our jobs. You photograph, I analyze. Detectives investigate. When there's an investigation to be had." Aldrich put his spectacles back on, and his eyes behind the thick lenses were sad but firm. "Don't make this your crusade, Brennan. You have a family, a career, a daughter who needs her father. Don't throw it away chasing shadows." Elwood left the office. He understood the message. Drop it. Forget it. Move on. The system had spoken. He couldn't. From that day forward, his work changed. He still did his job, still made his photographs, still maintained his professional detachment on the surface. But now he was looking. Actively, deliberately looking. Every crime scene, every body, every detail. He examined collars, lapels, shoulders, anywhere a button might be placed. He was hunting the hunter. He started keeping detailed records beyond the photographs. A notebook, hidden in the footlocker with the duplicate prints. Dates, locations, victim descriptions, circumstances of death. Which detective responded? Which medical examiner signed the death certificate? Which prosecutor declined to file charges? He cross-referenced against department files when he could access them, read through old case summaries during slow afternoons, memorize details. He became obsessed in a quiet, methodical way that nobody noticed because he was careful never to let it show at work. At home, after Constance and Helen went to bed, he'd spread the photographs and notes on the kitchen table, studying them by lamplight, looking for connections beyond the buttons. Were the victims connected? Did they know each other? Frequent the same places? He found no links. They came from different neighborhoods, different backgrounds, different lives. The only common thread was their vulnerability and that damned button. Years passed. The Great Depression deepened, then gradually eased. War broke out in Europe in 1939. First Poland, then France, then the Battle of Britain crackling over radio broadcasts. America remained neutral but began arming itself, preparing. Detroit's factories, which had been gasping through the Depression, roared back to life. The arsenal of democracy, the newspapers called it. Willow's Run churned out bombers. The tank plant on Michigan Avenue ran 3 shifts. The city swelled with war workers from Alabama, Tennessee, Arkansas, drawn north by jobs and decent wages. With them came new tensions, new crimes, new bodies for Elwood to photograph. And through it all, he looked. Always looked. In June 1941, 6 months before Pearl Harbor, he found the 4th button. The location was an abandoned streetcar barn on the west side, near the old interurban tracks. The body was discovered by scrap metal scavengers, a woman in her 40s, apparent fall from a rusted ladder leading to the maintenance loft. Broken neck. Detective Hargrove, now graying and heavier, ruled it accidental within hours. __quote _29 __. Elwood photographed the scene with his usual thoroughness, and when he developed the prints that evening, working late after the other lab technicians had gone home, there it was. On the woman's faded cardigan sweater, pinned near the left shoulder. The button. Bone, cracked, 4-petal clover. Identical to the others. 4 bodies now. 10 years. The pattern continued. He made his notes, added the photographs to his archive. Didn't bother reporting it. He knew what would happen. Aldrich would dismiss it. The system would protect itself. The case would remain closed. After Pearl Harbor, when America entered the war, Detroit transformed completely. The factory work intensified. Shifts ran around the clock. The city's population surged. Housing grew scarce. Tempers flared. Crime rates climbed. The police department, already understaffed, struggled to keep up. Elwood's workload doubled. He photographed murder scenes in crowded rooming houses where 10 people shared one bathroom. Bar fights that turned fatal. Domestic disputes that ended in blood. Industrial accidents at the war plants where exhausted workers made mistakes around dangerous machinery. He documented it all with his camera, his trained eye, his steady hands. And always, always, he looked for the button. November 1943. The war raged on 3 continents. The newspapers carried casualty lists from Italy, from the Pacific Islands. Gold Star flags hung in windows throughout Detroit. In a cheap hotel on Michigan Avenue, in a room that cost 35 cents a night, a woman was found dead. Apparent drug overdose, empty pill bottle on the nightstand, needle marks on her arms. The medical examiner signed off within 24 hours. Accidental death due to narcotics. Elwood photographed the room, the sagging bed, the peeling wallpaper, the woman's body, small and fragile in death. And on her collar, sewn with careful stitches, the button. 5 bodies. 12 years. The hunt continued. He felt it then, standing in that shabby hotel room with the smell of death and chemicals and old cigarette smoke, felt it like a weight settling on his chest. Whoever was doing this had power, real institutional power. Because these weren't just cases being closed, they were being closed fast, efficiently, with minimal scrutiny. Death certificates signed immediately, bodies released for burial within days, no autopsies ordered, no follow-up inquiries made, no questions asked. Someone was ensuring these deaths slipped through the cracks, someone high enough in the system to make it happen smoothly, repeatedly, year after year. He began paying closer attention to the administrative machinery. Who signed which documents? Which officials touched these cases? He couldn't access all the records. Much of it was above his pay grade, but he picked up fragments, overheard conversations, noticed patterns in paperwork, saw how these particular cases moved through channels differently than others. And slowly, over months of careful attention, a picture emerged. Different detectives investigated these cases: Hargrove, Kowalski, Patterson, others. Different medical examiners signed the certificates: Dr. Whitmore, Dr. Chen, Dr. Kowalski. Different prosecutors declined to file charges. No single individual appeared in every case, but they all reported to the same chain of command. And at the top of that chain, overseeing public safety for the city, sat Deputy Commissioner Cornelius Blackwell Pendergast. Elwood had seen Pendergast a few times over the years, at department ceremonies, award presentations, official photographs. A distinguished man in his late 40s, always impeccably dressed, with silver hair and the bearing of someone accustomed to authority. Decorated in the Great War. 30 years in public service. Connected to every level of city government. The kind of man whose name appeared in the society pages, who sat on charity boards, whose daughter had married a federal judge. Was it possible? Could someone that prominent, that respected, be a killer? Elwood had no proof, only a pattern. And patterns, as Aldrich had told him, weren't evidence. In February 1945, as Allied forces crossed the Rhine and pushed into Germany, as victory in Europe became inevitable and newspapers carried photographs of liberated towns and advancing armies, Elwood found the sixth button. The location was near the waterfront, in the industrial zone where the river curved past warehouses and docks. The body belonged to Florence Dietrich, age 38, identified by papers in her purse. She'd worked sporadically at a canning factory, lived in a boarding house on Fort Street. According to witnesses at the Anchor Tavern 3 blocks away, she'd been drinking there the evening of February 10th, a Saturday. She'd left around midnight, walking unsteadily. Nobody paid much attention. She was a regular, usually drank until her money ran out, then walked home. She never made it home. Longshoremen found her body in the water near Dock 7 on Monday morning, February 12th. She'd been in the river approximately 36 hours, according to the medical examiner. Cause of death? Drowning while intoxicated. Blood alcohol level high enough to impair judgment and motor control. The theory: she'd wandered toward the docks, perhaps seeking a shortcut or simply confused, fallen into the river. The water was 34 degrees Fahrenheit. She wouldn't have lasted long even if she could swim. Tragic, but not unusual. The waterfront claimed bodies every year. Drunks who wandered too close to the edge, workers who slipped on icy docks, suicides who chose drowning over other methods. One more death among many. Case closed. Elwood photographed the body in the Wayne County morgue on Tuesday afternoon. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting their cold white glow. Florence Dietrich lay on the steel table, her skin pale and waterlogged, her hair still damp despite having been pulled from the river a day earlier. Her clothes were folded neatly on a side table: the sodden dress, the worn shoes, the heavy wool coat. Elwood photographed according to standard protocol: full body, front and back, close-ups of any marks or injuries, the bruising on her temple where she'd struck something, perhaps the dock pilings as she fell, her hands showing no defensive wounds, standard documentation. Then he photographed the coat, and there, pinned near the collar, water-damaged but unmistakable, was the button. Bone, cracked, 4-petal clover. Number 6. 6 bodies, 14 years. from 1931 to 1945. He sat in the darkroom that night, long after everyone else had gone home, staring at the photographs hanging on the drawing line. 6 women, 6 buttons, 14 years of perfect murders disguised as accidents. And the system had protected the killer every single time. Elwood made a decision. He would compile everything. Every photograph, every note, every observation from 14 years of investigation. He would create an irrefutable documentary record, and he would take it outside the Detroit system, to someone who couldn't be bought or intimidated or ordered to look the other way. He would send it to Washington, to the Federal Bureau of Investigation. He spent 2 weeks organizing the materials, working at home in the evenings after Constance and Helen had gone to bed. He spread everything on the kitchen table, photographs arranged in chronological order, detailed written summaries of each case, copies of official death certificates and case file summaries he'd managed to obtain, his own notes documenting patterns in how these cases were handled differently from others. The kitchen became his war room. Each night after dinner, after Helen finished her homework and Constance listened to her evening radio programs, after both had retired to their bedrooms, Elwood would clear the table and lay out his evidence. 7 case files, 7 victims, 14 years of documentation. He created a master timeline on a long sheet of butcher paper. February 1931, Margaret Oleander. November 1934, Dorothea Kaminsky. January 1938, Ruth Stavros. June 1941, Vera Holcomb. November 1943, Alice Reeves. February 1945, Florence Dietrich. And now, March 1945, victim number 7, still unnamed in his notes because he hadn't yet processed all the paperwork. For each victim, he compiled a comprehensive package. Multiple photographs showing the body, the scene, the button in close-up detail. A typed summary of official findings, cause of death, circumstances, investigating officers. His own observations about inconsistencies or suspicious elements. Copies of witness statements where available. Time logs showing how quickly cases were closed. He also documented the administrative patterns. Which officials touched these cases? How paperwork moved through channels. Which prosecutors declined to prosecute, which medical examiners signed death certificates without ordering autopsies, which detectives filed perfunctory reports and closed investigations within hours. The pattern was there if you looked for it. These 7 cases moved through the system differently than comparable cases. Faster, smoother, with less scrutiny, as if someone was greasing the wheels, ensuring they slipped through without catching attention. He included everything except one thing. He didn't name Cornelius Blackwell Pendergast. He had no direct proof linking him to the murders, only circumstantial evidence about administrative patterns and the fact that all these cases fell under his ultimate oversight as deputy commissioner. Accusing a prominent official without proof would destroy his credibility, turn the whole package into what Aldrich would call a conspiracy theory. The FBI would need to investigate properly, subpoena records, question officials under oath, perhaps even conduct surveillance. They had resources and authority Elwood lacked. Instead, he laid out the facts objectively and let them speak for themselves. 7 murders disguised as accidents, the button signature linking them, the systematic cover-up. Any competent investigator examining this material would reach the same conclusions Elwood had reached. And federal investigators, outside Detroit's political machine, would have the independence to pursue the truth wherever it led. He even managed to obtain one of the buttons. The most recent victim's coat had been stored in the evidence room before being released to the morgue. Elwood carefully removed the button, documented its removal with photographs, and placed it in a small cotton-lined box. Physical evidence, something the FBI lab could examine. He sealed everything in a large manila envelope. On the outside, he wrote in careful block letters, Federal Bureau of Investigation, Criminal Investigation Division, Washington, D.C. Attention, Director J. Edgar Hoover. Urgent, serial homicide case. He planned to mail it on Monday, April 2nd, 1945. He'd drop it at the main post office downtown, registered mail, return receipt requested. But on March 15, 1945, before he could send the package, the killer struck again. Elwood got the call at 2 p.m. Body discovered in the industrial district, near the old warehouses by the river. He drove there in the department Ford, carrying his camera case and evidence kit. The afternoon was overcast, threatening rain. Factory smokestacks along the river belched dark clouds. The war plants ran continuously now, 3 shifts around the clock, producing materiel for the final push into Germany and the ongoing campaign in the Pacific. The scene was in a disused warehouse, one of dozens abandoned during the Depression and never reclaimed. The building stood among others of its kind. Red brick facades crumbling, windows broken or boarded, roofs sagging. The kind of place vagrants used for shelter, where fires were built in oil drums for warmth, where the city's invisible population lived in the margins. Detective Patterson was already there, along with a medical examiner's assistant. Patterson was young, maybe 30, one of the new generation of detectives hired during the war boom to replace men who'd enlisted or been drafted. He had the case folder in hand when Elwood arrived. "Look straight forward," Patterson said, walking Elwood through the scene. "Carbon monoxide poisoning. She was sleeping rough in here, had a kerosene heater going. You can see it there, knocked over. Heater malfunctioned, room filled with fumes. She went to sleep and never woke up. Happens every winter." The victim lay near the overturned heater, curled on her side on a pile of newspapers and rags that served as bedding. Middle-aged woman, thin, wearing layers of worn clothing against the March cold. Her face was peaceful, which was typical for carbon monoxide deaths. People just drifted off, didn't struggle, didn't suffer. "ID?" Elwood asked, setting up his camera equipment. "Nothing on her. We'll print her, see if anything comes up. Probably just another Jane Doe for Potter's Field." Patterson shrugged. "Sad, but what can you do? Make sure you get good shots of the heater position. ME will want to see the setup for the report." Elwood photographed methodically, maintaining his professional mask. Wide shots of the warehouse interior showing the makeshift camp. The overturned kerosene heater, its wick still visible, fuel spilled on the concrete floor. The body's position, the bedding, the few possessions scattered nearby. A battered suitcase, a tin cup, a pair of torn gloves. He moved closer for detail shots. The woman's face, serene in death. Her hands, work-worn and scarred. And then he saw it, and his breath caught in his throat, but he forced himself to continue as if nothing was wrong. On her jacket collar, pinned carefully with strong thread, the button. Bone, cracked, 4-petal clover. Number 7. He photographed it. Multiple angles, multiple exposures. His hands were steady despite the adrenaline flooding his system, despite the voice in his head screaming that this was it. This confirmed everything. This proved the pattern beyond any doubt. 7 victims, 14 years. 1931 to 1945. All the pieces falling into place. He finished documenting the scene, packed his equipment, told Patterson he'd have the prints ready by tomorrow. Drove back to the bureau through afternoon traffic, his mind racing. This victim was different from the others in one crucial way. Timing. The killer had struck again just 2 weeks after the previous victim. In 14 years, he'd never struck this quickly. The pattern had been years between victims. Why accelerate now? Unless the killer knew that Elwood had discovered the pattern, knew that an investigation was forming. And this 7th victim was a message, a demonstration. Look what I can do. Look how easily I can kill. Look how the system will protect me, no matter what you think you've discovered. Or maybe the killer didn't know about Elwood specifically, but sensed pressure generally. Maybe he felt investigators circling, felt the walls closing in, and was compelled to act once more before circumstances made it impossible. Either way, this 7th victim sealed Elwood's decision. He had to get this information to Washington immediately. Not Monday, tomorrow. He'd mail it Saturday morning from the main post office downtown, Registered mail. Return receipt requested. 3 days maximum for delivery. By Tuesday or Wednesday next week, federal investigators would have his package. They'd start making inquiries. The investigation would begin. He made the prints, filed the official set, made his duplicates, added them to the envelope for Washington. That evening at home, he told Constance he'd be sending an important package to federal authorities. Didn't explain in detail. He'd learned long ago not to burden her with the darkness of his work, but said enough that she understood it was serious. "Will there be trouble?" she asked quietly. "Maybe, but it's the right thing." She nodded, didn't argue. She'd married a man who saw his work as a duty, who believed in justice even when the system failed. She wouldn't ask him to be different. On March 31st, 1945, Elwood Thatcher Brennan came to work at 8 a.m. as usual. He had the sealed envelope in his briefcase. His plan was to finish processing the previous day's routine cases, then leave at lunch to go to the post office, mail the package, start the wheels turning. At 11:30 a.m., he was in the darkroom, developing prints from a burglary scene. The red safe light cast its dim glow. The chemicals smelled sharp and familiar. He moved from tray to tray, following the process he'd performed thousands of times. The pain came suddenly, crushing pressure in his chest, radiating down his left arm. The room tilted. He tried to call out but couldn't catch his breath. He reached for the door, but his legs gave way. Elwood Thatcher Brennan collapsed beside his developing table. The red light continued to glow. The chemicals continued their work. And slowly, in the darkness behind his eyes, his consciousness faded. A clerk found him at 1 p.m. when he didn't emerge for lunch. The darkroom door was locked from inside. They had to break the lock. By then, it was too late. The medical examiner's report listed the cause of death as myocardial infarction, heart attack, sudden and fatal. The report noted that Brennan had been a heavy smoker for years, worked long hours in a stressful occupation, showed signs of chronic fatigue. The conclusion? Death by natural causes. No autopsy was deemed necessary. The funeral was held on April 4, 1945, at Woodlawn Cemetery. Small service. Constance, Helen, a handful of colleagues from the Bureau. Aldrich gave a brief eulogy about dedicated service, professional excellence, a man who did his duty faithfully for 17 years. The words were sincere but generic, the kind of thing said at every policeman's funeral. What Aldrich didn't mention, what nobody mentioned, was the timing. How Elwood had been healthy, working normally, and then died suddenly just 16 days after photographing the 7th victim. How convenient that was. How fortunate for someone. They buried Elwood in a simple plot. Helen, 15 years old and numb with grief, stood beside her mother and didn't cry. Couldn't cry. It felt unreal, like something happening to someone else's family. After the funeral, life continued. It had to. Constance went back to work at the courthouse. Helen went back to school. The war in Europe ended in May. Victory celebrations, newspapers full of photographs from liberated concentration camps, then the atomic bombs in August and Japan's surrender. The boys came home. Detroit's war plants retooled for peacetime production. Life moved forward. But Constance couldn't forget. She knew her husband had been investigating something, knew he'd been planning to contact federal authorities. After the funeral, she searched their apartment thoroughly, found the footlocker in the closet, found the envelope addressed to the FBI, sealed but unsent. She sat on the floor with the envelope in her lap, thinking, she should mail it. That's what Elwood had planned. Let the FBI handle it. Finish what he'd started. But she was 40 years old, a widow with a teenage daughter to support. She had no income beyond Elwood's modest pension and her own secretarial salary. If she mailed this envelope, if she made trouble, what would happen? Would they stop the pension? Would she lose her job at the courthouse? Would someone come after her? After Helen? Constance sat there for a long time, weighing duty against survival, courage against fear, what was right against what was safe. In the end, fear won. Not because she was weak, but because she was a mother. Helen was 15, with her whole life ahead of her. Constance couldn't risk that life for an investigation that might go nowhere, that might just make her husband's death meaningless by getting his family destroyed too. She put the envelope back in the footlocker, locked it, hid the key, and never spoke of it to anyone, not even Helen. The footlocker went into storage when Constance moved to a smaller apartment in 1946, then into a basement storage room when she moved again in 1948. Eventually, when she remarried in 1952, a nice widower named Arthur Pemberton who worked for the Postal Service, it went into a commercial storage unit along with other items from her first marriage that she couldn't bear to throw away, but didn't want in her new home. The truth stayed buried for 38 years. Helen Brennan grew up, graduated from high school, worked as a bank clerk, married a returning veteran named Thomas Lattimore in 1950. They had 2 children, a son born in 1951, a daughter in 1953. Helen remembered her father only dimly by then, a quiet man who smelled of chemicals, who had gentle hands and sad eyes, who died when she was 15. She knew he'd worked for the police department as a photographer. She knew he'd died of a heart attack. She never knew about his investigation. Her mother never told her. Constance Pemberton died in 1983 at the age of 78, a peaceful death. She went to sleep one night and didn't wake up. Helen, now 53, had the task of settling her mother's estate. The house in Dearborn, the modest savings account, the personal effects, and the storage unit in Southwest Detroit that nobody had opened in 30 years. Helen went there on a gray Saturday in November, armed with the key from her mother's effects and a determination to finally clear out decades of accumulated items. The unit was full of boxes, Christmas decorations, her stepfather's tools, old furniture, trunks of clothes from the 1940s. And in the back corner, covered with a tarp, a metal footlocker with U.S. Army stenciled on the side. Her father's footlocker from his service days. She recognized it from old photographs. It was locked. She forced it open with a screwdriver from her stepfather's toolbox. Inside, photographs. Hundreds of photographs, all black and white, all crime scenes, all carefully labeled in her father's neat handwriting with dates and locations. And beneath the photographs, a sealed manila envelope with Federal Bureau of Investigation written on it. And beneath that, notebooks filled with her father's notes, dates, observations, connections, theories. Helen sat on the cold concrete floor of the storage unit and read through everything, all the notes, all the case summaries, all the chronology. 7 murders disguised as accidents, 7 identical buttons marking the victims, 14 years of methodical hunting by someone who knew the system would protect him, and her father's careful, obsessive documentation of it all. And then the envelope. Never mailed, never sent. Her father had died before he could expose the truth. Helen read through everything twice, making sure she understood. Then she checked the dates. Her father had photographed the 7th victim on March 15, 1945. He died on March 31st, 16 days later. Just long enough for someone to realize he discovered the pattern. Just long enough for someone to arrange an accident. Except her father's death hadn't been ruled an accident. It had been ruled natural causes. A heart attack. Convenient, quick, raising no suspicions. Helen sat there surrounded by photographs of dead women and evidence of a cover-up that had lasted nearly 40 years, and she wept. She wept for the father she'd lost when she was 15. For the mother who'd lived with this secret, too afraid to act. For 7 women who'd been murdered and forgotten. For justice denied. Then she dried her eyes and made a decision. She would finish what her father started. The next Monday, she took all the materials to the Wayne County Prosecutor's office. They listened politely, examined the photographs, the notes, the button that her father had preserved in its cotton-lined box. Then the assistant prosecutor, a young woman in her 30s, shook her head regretfully. Helen tried the Detroit Police Department next. Same response. Sympathetic but unhelpful. Too old, too cold, too circumstantial. She went to the Detroit Free Press. The Metro editor, a cynical man in his 50s who'd seen everything, listened to her story, examined the materials, then said, "Look, this is interesting history, but it's 40 years old. Everyone involved is dead. Pendergast, if he was indeed the killer, died in 68. Your father died in 45. The victims died in the 30s and 40s. Who am I writing about? Ghosts? My readers want stories about what's happening now, not ancient history nobody can verify." Helen tried other venues, local TV stations, community newspapers, historical societies. Everywhere she met the same wall. Too old, too unverifiable, too controversial to touch. She realized then that the truth wasn't wanted. The system still protected its own, even dead ones, even decades later. Too many people had connections to Pendergast's era. Too many careers had been built under his patronage. Too many current officials had fathers or grandfathers who'd worked in that system. Exposing the truth would mean admitting the corruption went deep and lasted long. Nobody wanted that. But Helen didn't give up entirely. She made copies of everything and mailed them to various authorities, to the FBI, the same address her father had written on his envelope 40 years ago, to the state attorney general, to civil rights organizations and legal watchdog groups. Most letters went unanswered, but one reached someone who remembered. Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Edmund Wainwright, retired U.S. Army, 71 years old, living in Arlington, Virginia, received Helen's letter in December 1983. He read it slowly, carefully, in the sunroom of his townhouse while his wife puttered in the kitchen and Christmas decorations twinkled on the tree in the living room. He read it twice. Then he went to his study, unlocked his filing cabinet, and retrieved a folder he'd kept for 38 years. Inside was a letter, yellowed with age, postmarked Detroit, Michigan, March 30th, 1945. The return address: E.T. Brennan, Detroit Police Department, Bureau of Criminal Identification. Marcus had been a young Army intelligence captain in 1945, stationed at Fort Wayne in Detroit, liaising with local authorities on security matters. Elwood Brennan had contacted him, asking to meet, saying he had information about a serial killer operating under official protection. They'd scheduled a meeting for April 2nd, 1945. Elwood never made that meeting. He died on March 31st. Marcus had filed the letter away, told himself it was probably nothing, that Brennan had died of natural causes just as the death certificate stated. But he'd kept the letter. For 38 years he'd kept it, and sometimes, late at night, he'd wondered. Now he knew. He called Helen Lattimore. His voice trembled when she answered, not from age, though he was old, but from shame. __, quote _42 __. Marcus paused, gathering himself. Felon's breath caught. "Can you help now?" Long silence. Then, "Everyone involved is dead, Mrs. Lattimore. Pendergast died in 1968. The detectives are gone. The officials who covered for him are gone. Your father is gone. There's no one left to prosecute or punish. But I can do one thing. I can tell you what I learned back then, before I let fear shut me down. I can give you the full truth." And he told her. He told her that in early 1931, Cornelius Blackwell Pendergast had purchased an estate lot from an auction of a deceased collector's belongings. Among the items were several dozen antique bone buttons from the 1890s, carved with various designs. Pendergast had kept them, displayed them in a cabinet in his office. He told her that Pendergast had a pathology, a need for control, for power over life and death. That he'd begun killing in 1931 and continued for 14 years. That he'd chosen victims carefully, women on society's margins, whose deaths wouldn't be investigated too closely. He told her that Pendergast had used his position as deputy commissioner to ensure cases were closed quickly, that he'd had detectives, prosecutors, and medical examiners in his pocket, not because they were corrupt necessarily, but because they followed the chain of command, and Pendergast was at the top of that chain. He told her that Elwood Brennan had gotten too close to the truth, that someone, probably Pendergast himself, had learned about the federal meeting scheduled for April 2nd, that Elwood's quote 46 had been anything but natural. Helen asked, her voice steady despite the tears on her face. Helen sat in silence, absorbing this. Then, Marcus's voice broke. Because I was 29 years old, newly promoted, married with a baby on the way. Because Pendergast had powerful friends in Army command. Because I convinced myself I might be wrong, that it was all circumstantial. Because I was a coward. He paused. I've spent 38 years living with that cowardice, Mrs. Lattimore. I can't undo it, but I can at least give you the truth now. After the call, Helen sat for a long time thinking. The truth was out. At least she knew it. But what good was truth without justice? Pendergast was dead, had died peacefully in his bed surrounded by honors. Her father was dead, his sacrifice forgotten. The 7 victims were dead, buried in unmarked graves or forgotten cemetery plots. But then Helen thought, maybe justice wasn't about punishment. Maybe, when punishment was impossible, justice was about memory. About making sure these deaths weren't forgotten. About honoring those who'd tried to fight. She gathered all the materials, photographs, notes, documents, testimonies, and compiled them into a book. She wrote it herself over 6 months, working evenings and weekends. It wasn't long, maybe 200 pages, but it told the whole story. Her father's investigation, the 7 victims, the cover-up, Pendergast's crimes, the system that protected him. She titled it, The Button, an investigation into serial murder and official corruption in 1930s to 1940s Detroit. She self-published 100 copies in 1984, paying for it with her own savings. Simple black cover with a photograph of the bone button on the front. The same photograph her father had taken in 1945, enlarged and cleaned up by a professional photo restorer. She wrote the book herself, working evenings and weekends for 6 months. It wasn't long, about 200 pages, but it told the complete story. Her father's background and career. The 7 victims, each given a full chapter with whatever biographical details she could uncover. The pattern of the buttons, the administrative cover-up, Pendergast's background and connections, the system that protected him, Marcus Wainwright's testimony about her father's planned federal meeting and subsequent death, the evidence suggesting her father's heart attack hadn't been natural. She included photographs throughout, crime scene images her father had taken, the 7 buttons in sequence, Pendergast's official portraits from city records, maps showing victim locations across Detroit, documents showing how quickly cases were closed. Everything laid out in black and white, irrefutable and damning. She didn't sensationalize it. The prose was straightforward, almost clinical. She let the facts speak for themselves. This wasn't a thriller or a true crime potboiler. This was a historical record, a memorial, a refusal to let these deaths be forgotten. The book's epilogue was a single page, ___, quote, _ 53 ___. Most copies gathered dust on shelves. Most people who received them probably never read past the first chapter. But some did read, and some remembered. Today, in the Detroit Historical Museum's permanent collection on crime history, you can find one of those 100 books. And beside it, in a glass display case, sits a metal footlocker with U.S. Army stenciled on its side. Inside are photographs, hundreds of them, documenting 17 years of crime scenes and one man's quiet crusade for justice. And in the center of the display, under careful lighting, sits a small bone button. Yellowed with age, cracked down the center, carved with 4 petals resembling a clover. The museum placard reads, ___, quote _54 ___. Tour guides sometimes bring school groups to see it. They tell the story of Elwood Brennan, the police photographer who discovered a pattern nobody wanted to see. They talk about courage and corruption, justice and cover-ups, the price of speaking truth to power. The question they always end with, did he fail? The system protected the killer. The murders went unpunished. Elwood died before he could expose the truth. But here's what remains: his photographs, his notes, his daughter's book, this story. The evidence still exists, still speaks, still accuses. And that bone button in its museum case, preserved for future generations, stands as testimony. Not to justice achieved, but to justice attempted. To one man's refusal to look away. To the idea that documentation matters, that truth matters, even when it comes too late to save anyone. Because documents, unlike people, don't die. They wait, they endure, they bear witness. And sometimes, decades later, they tell stories that need to be told. Stories like this one.